Good morning or good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia Karam. I'm regional director at the International Republican Institute, where I oversee a portfolio of programs that's focused on citizen responsive governance. This panel today will explore the expanding influence of external actors like Russia, the European Union, and China in the Middle East, the alliances they've formed and the dynamics they've unleashed by their interventions. Our panelists will also look at how changes in the policies of the US may impact these dynamics. For some context, at IRI, we're very interested in the role and influence of external powers like China and Russia, especially in undermining progress in fragile democracies. We're also interested in the impact of Chinese and Russian disinformation, plus Iranian, on perceptions of democracy in the US, and the attractiveness of a more authoritarian model of governance, especially where COVID responses have been concerned. So this is with great excitement that I'm turning to the panel today, which has four distinguished speakers joining us. And thank you to Carnegie for bringing us together. Our four speakers are Evan Feigenbaum, who is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Florence Gaub, who's the Deputy Director of the EU ISS, where she's in charge of research, Marc Pierini, who's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, whose research also focuses on Turkey, and Dmitri Trenin, who's the Director of Carnegie Moscow Center and has been at the center for a while. The session will be structured as a Q&A that will integrate some of my questions and some of the audience's questions, especially towards the end. I've asked the panelists to limit their responses to about 1 to 3 minutes per question. So without further ado, if I may turn to Dmitri and look a little bit very briefly at Russia. And let me ask you, taking into account that over the last 5 years, Russia's involvement in the Middle East has expanded, how do you evaluate Russia's legacy in the region during this period?
Well, thank you, Patricia. Thank you also for coming to me first. Well, Russia is not a new actor. It was in the Middle East, was very much involved in Middle Eastern affairs as the Soviet Union. And prior to that, as the Russian Empire, it was also present in parts of the Middle East. Now, with regard to Russia's legacy, of the last 5 years, I would say that it has been able to establish or reestablish, to be exact, its presence in the region. Second, it has seen its status as a major power confirmed. If you can wage war in the Middle East and not lose for 5 years, then I think you qualify as a major power. I think it has also impressed people by standing by its allies, in this case, Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. It has demonstrated a capable military in conjunction with a competent diplomatic service, which I think is a great combination. It has been able to form temporary alignments, not alliances, of course, but alignments with countries such as Turkey and Iran. It has been able to stay on speaking terms with just about everyone in the region, including, say, Israel and Iran at the same time. And it has been able to deconflict with the United States of America, operating in the same country on not exactly on the same side in Syria, and yet being able, alongside the United States, not to step on the other guy's toes. I would stop here.
If I may ask you a follow-up question, what do you feel are the implications of its ongoing involvement, and what do you see as being Moscow's ambitions in the Middle East moving into 2021?
Well, I think in 2021, what they're doing is not just keeping their military and political presence, but expanding it. Just a couple of days ago, Russia and Iran signed a deal about a Russian naval facility at Port Sudan, which is right in the middle of the Red Sea coast, a very strategic position. This is expansion of Russian presence. I think Russia will be keeping what it has achieved particularly in Syria, and it will work toward some kind of a political settlement in Syria, but the expectations are not very high. It's the Astana process that Russia is part of, and they understand that there are forces that are acting against that, and some of those forces may be even sitting in Damascus. So it's a complicated situation, but the footprint is somewhat expanding.
I am myself very interested in Syria, so I can't help but follow up by asking you if you can talk a little bit about Russian policy towards Syria and where Russia stands with respect in particular to the Assad regime. One question that comes to mind is under which circumstances might Moscow sacrifice Assad, and would it be able to do so, or is it able to do so?
Well, I've been hearing the question about Russia sacrificing, dropping Assad for 5 years now. I don't think this is very high on the Kremlin's agenda. They have no illusions about Bashar al-Assad, but they would be prepared to embrace a Syria without Bashar al-Assad if there is a favorable political settlement that would be based on an agreement that Russia is trying to work out through the Astana process. And then any departure of Bashar al-Assad would have to be an honorable departure, a departure that would not run against the will of Bashar himself, and it would not exclude the forces for which Bashar is a champion from the future settlement of Syria. So the issue is not Russia dropping Bashar. The issue is getting Bashar to accept power sharing, and that is hard. So Russia is more concerned about getting Bashar to accept a Syria in which he and his clan, his party, do not hold 100% of power, that they are able and willing to collaborate with other political forces in Syria. And that Syria, which would be friendly to Russia, is Russia's ideal. But it's very hard to get there. I think that people realize that in Moscow.
Thank you. Thank you, Dmitri. I'd like to just shift a little bit direction and ask Marc. I know, Marc, you've written extensively about Turkey and its increasing adventurism and maybe even adversarial actions, its aggressive stand towards the Eastern Med. Before we turn to Turkey completely, I'd like to maybe see if you can talk about Russia's priorities and or EU perception of Moscow's priorities vis-a-vis the Mediterranean in particular, in addition to sort of what is the EU perception of the Moscow-Ankara duet and the problems it poses to Europe?
Yes, I think from Brussels' perspective, which is EU and NATO headquarters as well, you had two game changers this year and last year. in the Mediterranean and Middle East. One is Russia, the other is Turkey. These are two actors who are much more present now than they were only a few years ago. Russia has boots on the ground, has facilities, bases in Syria, one Navy, one Air Force, using them as stepping stone to Libya, smaller presence in Libya, but still, Al Jufra and Sirte. In a way, in this strange relationship that Dmitri touched upon between Turkey and Russia, you have convergences in some cases or sharp differences in other cases. But essentially, you can see that Russia has used Turkey to facilitate its presence in the region. One example, Turkey is a NATO member, but has granted the Russian Air Force overflight rights to their base near Latakia in Syria, which is a stepping stone to go on forward to Libya or other places. Let alone, of course, what was discussed in the previous panel, the deployment of S-400 missile. So you have, from a European point of view, once again, a major stake in the region, but a much bigger presence of Russia in the fields that matter most to the EU. One is security. Terrorism is one. For example, Syrian jihadists transported by both Turkey and Russia to Libya. You have oil and gas, where, of course, Russia is a major player via Turkey through Turkstream and Southeastern Europe, but also offshore in Egypt, offshore in Libya, in Lebanon, sorry, and surely with an eye on the Libyan resources. Further afield, the EU is, of course, concerned by what is happening in the Sahel, and of course, there the security and the stability of Libya is very important from both a terrorism point of view, but also a migration point of view. So all of this tells you that this renewed, enhanced presence of Russia in the region, including possibly with a permanent military base in Libya, is something very big for the EU. And in confronting this, so far, the EU has basically been the absent actor, if you want. Very big paradox because, as I explained, terrorism, energy, refugees, these are phenomena where you have direct EU interest, where, like in migration refugees, where the EU is the first impacted region, but the EU has not drawn the conclusion that it has a major reason to be present in that particular area. This may change under the Biden administration because one, we will for sure break with 4 years of unprecedented unpredictability of the Trump presidency. So there is strong hope. 4 days ago, the European Council of Heads of State and Government said that they were looking forward to a renewed dialogue with the US. And because the impact of Russia's presence in the Mediterranean, plus, of course, Russia's posture vis-à-vis NATO is so huge, probably we'll see more dialogue between Washington and Brussels.
So if I may ask you to talk maybe a little bit about this, because it ties into my next question, which had to do with, again, the prospects of US-EU reconnection after January 20, and whether this, and we may be getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the panel, but it'd be interesting to explore at this point whether this could trigger an area of more confident relations and maybe more policy coordination on both.
Well, yes. You will remember that the first big event between the Trump presidency and European leaders was at the NATO summit, like 4 months after Trump came to power. And basically, it was so disruptive, not only in terms of you got to spend more, but also in terms of not listening to the conversation at all, that Chancellor Merkel came out of the meeting and said, well, now for our security, we Europeans have to understand that we are on our own. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But so far, as you've seen, because of a number of reasons, one being that not all EU member states or all Europeans in NATO are equal. Some are being military, some are not. In the meantime, you have Brexit happening. And in Germany, you still have this post-World War II debate on the size of the military, on foreign operations. So this has not happened. And Chancellor Merkel was right. And that was 4 years ago. So this may change now. After all, Donald Trump was the first American president in the last 70 years since, let's say, the creation of NATO and the launching of the first effort towards European integration to be openly hostile to Europe. He said so in so many ways, be it BMW cars or whatever. So he has destabilized really the European leaders. And of course, this has had consequences in the Middle East. You've seen the way in which abruptly, against the advice of most in his administration, Trump withdrew troops from northeastern Syria, where France and the UK had troops together with US special forces. This kind of thing has had a terrible impact in terms of confidence, but of course in terms of efficiency. So hopefully that will come to an end now, and I would suppose that starting on maybe not January 20, but 21st, a dialogue will reconnect.
Thank you, Marc. I'd like to turn briefly, since we're on the subject of the EU, to Florence. And just, Florence, if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you think European nations focus on domestic politics, including COVID lockdowns and vaccine rollout, how this might affect EU policy in MENA in 2021. Maybe we start there, and then I have a series of follow-up questions.
So I think that you mentioned domestic politics. I think that's a very good point, which is not just a result of our attention being very centered on what's happening in Europe. I think it's also the result of the fact that, for instance, migration numbers were affected by COVID. So because of lockdowns everywhere in the world, pretty much migration numbers into the EU since the beginning of the pandemic have decreased by 85%. So at the moment, it looks like the problem isn't actually there. Now, before the pandemic, for a third of Europeans, for a third of Europeans, this was the most important problem the EU was facing. So climate change was the second one, but migration for a third was really the most important one. So that at the moment means that the problem isn't there. And terrorism, for instance, which is perhaps the second dimension, is seen as not really an EU problem because it's something that happened in France, it's something that happened perhaps in Austria, but it's not directly linked to the Middle East. Because the terrorist attack in Austria was perpetrated by somebody who came from the Balkans originally. Then, of course, we have France, which is seen as a French migration problem, integration problem. So I think the perception that the problem isn't there is an illusion, and it will probably make a comeback in the next year. I want to say something, though, in addition to what Marc just said. When you read the joint communication that the EU issued on transatlantic relations, the Middle East is, of course, all over the place. So you have Iran, you have Syria, you have Yemen, you have the Sahel, you have Libya. To me, that looks like the EU, the Europeans together are looking to Washington to help them redefine their Middle East policy. Because, as Marc just said, the EU has been sidelined. But the danger that I see is that we were never fully aligned with Washington on all the problems in the region. So we as Europeans, Trump has triggered an important self-reflection process on strategic autonomy or sovereignty, no matter what you want to call it. This declaration reads a bit like, okay, maybe we don't have to do that reflection, and instead we can just hope for Washington to solve all our issues. Washington will not bail us out in Libya. Washington will not fix Syria. Washington will not fix Yemen. Perhaps we can hope for Washington to return to the GCPOA, but I don't think that everything will be well in the Middle East and North Africa just after this communication.
Florence, if I may ask a follow-up question having to do, I know you're not an Iran expert, but I'm curious to hear your take on what will the EU's approach to the Iran dossier be under a Biden administration?
Apologies for the phone ringing, but it must be my father. He's very persistent. So I think the EU approach is really focusing on getting Washington back into the agreement as it was. So from an European point of view, there is no need to redefine this, to renegotiate it, but really just to get Washington back in. And if that happens, that will be a win for the EU and a win for multilateralism more generally. But I think it's really a going back to 2015 approach.
Marc, if you will, I would like to turn it back to you and talk a little bit about Turkey and the EU. And I wonder if you might tackle the question of how has the EU's relationship with Turkey developed over the past year, and where is it heading? I know you've written about the EU needing to take a harder line towards Erdogan, and you did mention the EU being an absent actor in the region. You've also so what does the EU not procrastinating, so to speak, look like? And what do you think are priority actions that the EU should take in this regard?
Well, I think from a European perspective, you have two things happening in Turkey. One is deliberate provocations by the president in the Eastern Med, but also elsewhere. Terms like Nazis and fascists for Chancellor Merkel, check your mental health for President Macron, etc., etc. That is the president's, Turkish president's style, but it simply reflects domestic politics. The economy is going bad. The opinion polls are not very good for the governing alliance. Therefore, ramping up an hostile narrative with Europeans is always seen as profitable. Well, but that's a small thing. The main thing is that what you have now is an affirmation of power by Turkey, at least in its region, from Libya to the Caucasus, and together with a military buildup. The military buildup was planned in the early years of the AKP in power, that is 2003 onwards, and as it's now showing in a big way with armed drones, with new submarines, with a helicopter carrier coming in service this year, new small short-range missiles, etc., etc. And that is in itself a technical and a political game changer. Technical because, as we've seen in Idlib province in Syria, as we've seen around Tripoli of Libya, and as we've seen in Azerbaijan, tactical drones from Turkey have made a difference. But they also made a difference not just in military terms, but also in political terms, because they made Turkey a player in the politics of Libya, Syria, and Azerbaijan, or Azerbaijan versus Armenia, if you prefer, in a way that was not there a year ago. So that is a massive achievement for the president of Turkey. He says so. He said that about a week or two ago in one public speech. And then you have to look at it in different ways in the European perspective. One is that you have a theory about it. Turkey is the power in the middle, cannot be satisfied anymore with its membership of NATO. It has to have a balanced relationship with Russia, China, the Middle East, and others. That's a little too theorized, if I may say, because there is a lot of domestic politics in it, of course. But the main problem that we have, again, from an EU perspective and a NATO perspective, is that this sort of zigzagging policy in the region and the sort of challenges that are posed to the EU or to Greece, Cyprus, and others, but also to the US in a number of ways. That warrants now a very thorough assessment, probably jointly by the EU and the US, because it is disruptive. It is disruptive, of course, of NATO with the deployment of S-400 missiles. The missiles are there. They're not going to go away. Certainly, Russia will not accept to take them back. And that's a massive change in the European or in NATO missile defense architecture for Europe. And also, the military buildup is not going to go away. It may even be reinforced by sanctions by the US or by the EU. And we see that already with, when an engine for a tank is not available from Germany anymore since last year, you go to South Korea to get one. When you have trouble looming on jet engines or rocket engines, you turn to Ukraine, etc., etc. So I think not only the Turkish defense industry is extremely performing, innovative also. After all, in about a year, you'll have a high altitude, long endurance armed drone, something that only the US, China, and Israel can build. The French and the British are buying it from the US. So Turkey will be there on the market, and that in itself is a game changer. So we'll see how things turn out with the president of Turkey, but both in Washington and in Brussels, we'll have, I think, a thorough review of the policy.
Thank you. Before we start looking at China, and since we're on the subject of the EU and we talked about Russia, I'd like to just briefly ask Dmitri if he may tackle a question that has to do with looking at the incoming Biden administration. And do you think that a Biden administration will impact EU policy towards Russia, or how do you think a Biden administration will impact EU policy towards Russia?
Well, I think the Biden administration is determined to mobilize the West against what President-elect Biden calls China's challenge and Russia's threat. So that's a change from the situation under Donald Trump. But actually, Russian-European relations have taken a plunge to the lower depths in the last few years, but in particular the last few months. So Europe is, I think, as skeptical or, let's say, adversarially disposed toward Russia as the United States is. And I think that there'll be less and less daylight between the European approach to relations with Russia and the U.S. approach. So that's how it's seen. It's I think that the pressure on Russia from the West, as a result of the combined efforts of the United States and the European Union, will only grow in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Just turning to China, I'd like to ask Evan just a broad question as to China's strategy in the region. Evan, how would you evaluate sort of China's strategy and potential legacy in the Middle East? And what do you see as being Beijing's ambitions in the Middle East moving forward? And I ask this because I wonder if it's correct to observe that China's influence seems to be primarily related to economic investment, security, oil supplies, and cultural promotion, which to me signal a more opportunistic rather than a strategic approach in the MENA region. Is this the case? Will this continue to be China's policy in the region? And might China be involved more aggressively, more strategically, more militarily at some point in the region?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm struck at how security and political centric the conversation's been in the panel so far, because when you pivot to China at a macro level, obviously China's been able to steer a course that's involved developing relatively productive relations with poles of power in the region that historically have not had productive and stable relations with one another: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, the Emirates, Turkey, and so on. And they've done that first because they've not led with their chin geopolitically, but have really put economics at the center of their approach to the region. But then second, because of the increasing diversification of the economic offering. China, yes, has oil and gas, hydrocarbons, and energy-based liquid products at the center of it. But China's a trader, builder, lender, and investor. And it varies the nature of that offering from country to country in ways that I think have staying power and will have some interesting legacy effects. So just to pull a few of those threads for you. First, on diversification, both the Saudi and the Iraqi pieces on hydrocarbons obviously are significant. But when I look at China's economic profile and posture in the region, I see a lot more diversity than there was even 5 years ago. One piece is the digital backbone, information and communications technologies that they're building around the region. Second is construction. And then a third is marrying ICT to construction by building digital networks. And that comes to a second piece, which is to become a standard setter. Because what you find, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, is that when China builds it, whether it's 5G telecom backbone by using Huawei kit or its power generation systems, they build it to a Chinese standard. And so over time, they're able essentially to export their indigenous engineering standards, and they become default national, regional, and then potentially global standards. So that's an important legacy factor, because if you think about multinational players, that at minimum creates a standards harmonization problem with the standard, or in time, a plug and play problem for other multinationals that want to come into those settings. A third piece is finance. And I think the financial aspect is often underweighted. You have Middle Eastern funds, Gulf funds, ADIA, Mubadala, that are essentially in China looking for yield, multi-billion-dollar retail portfolio for ADIA in China. You have Middle Eastern sovereign funds that have bought into bond offerings from China. But then the flip, which is the flow of Chinese capital into the Middle East. And frankly, using Dubai and other places as dropping off points to move into Africa and other places. Dubai, for example, has the potential to be an Islamic finance hub for China, which wants to move into that space. Then you have upskilling. There are 14,000 Arab students in China. So you have a generation mostly of master's and PhD students that are going to be trained, which is important if you think about developmental choices. And then last, I would put vaccines onto your radar. They've run vaccine trials in the Emirates, for example, which has very conspicuously publicly vaccinated its elite, including Sheikh Maktoum, who was on television getting a Chinese Sinopharm vaccine in his arm. Bahrain, Egypt, may use Chinese vaccines. And my view is that will have bellwether and cascade effects across the region. So I do think the picture is increasingly diversified. And that's not to say that the security and diplomatic aspects aren't there, but by putting economics at the center, it gives China a different kind of profile, posture, and potentially legacy in time that really, I think, will be distinctive and have an impact on the developmental agenda of the region.
So I can't help, I mean, what you say strikes a chord, because I was recently in Iraq, and I actually encountered a lot of politicians who'd been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccine, which is interesting in itself. But I can't help but ask then, would you assess that China is looking to expand its influence diplomatically and politically outside of economically? And how does that, what does that expansion look like?
Well, it's always been there. I mean, they've been an arms sale player in the region since the 1980s. And they've been a diplomatic player in the region, but I think they've not seen fit to lead with their chin on it. So I think I do buy the argument that people make that over time, as their interests become diversified, they'll find themselves pulled more into a set of security and geopolitical questions. But I think they've been a very reluctant player on that. It will generally be more transactional for them. But we'll see how it evolves over time. But I think their strategy around the world has really been to put the economics at the center. And it's exactly why they've had a much more diversified and distinctive offering for the region.
You also mentioned sort of the China's ability to straddle sort of these relations with Saudi, Iran, and some others that aren't traditionally allies. Do you think this balance will impact forays into more diplomatic and political involvement? That's That's the question.
Well, I don't know. I mean, they couldn't pull off that trick if they were more, if they put strategy and geopolitics more at the center. It would be harder to do. I think, frankly, the United States is going to sharpen that set of contradictions with China over time. I think it was Dmitri, it may have been Marc, who alluded to the way the United States is increasingly offshoring its own China policy. American policy toward China has become increasingly securitized. And so the United States looks at commercial flows, whether it's of technology or data or capital or even people, increasingly refracted through a strategic prism of its own concern with China. And as it securitizes its own relationship, it's essentially offshoring its China policy by using administrative and legal instruments that it has to bring pressure on third-party governments and companies not to do business with China. And you see this in the American pressure in the region, for example, on Egypt or on the Emirates, to not use Huawei in the digital backbone. That's not met with a lot of success, precisely because of what I said earlier, which is China's been able to not depoliticize its offering, but it's not seen as a neutral, but I think it's seen as a self-interested player. And so what happens is that in all of those countries that you named, the demand side pull rather than the supply side push, the attraction of what China can offer to their own approaches, rather than China trying to push a one-size-fits-all model, gives them a stake with China that has enabled China to straddle a little bit across countries that have been strategic rivals and have not been able to view their relationships with the EU or Russia or the United States in a similar way. But that may get harder in time.
Yes, and comments are starting to come in, so I'll start integrating them in the discussion as they fit. In particular, there's one that's relevant at this juncture that is to you, Evan. How might Chinese policy change in the region, specifically as the US becomes more of an introvert in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's clearly already changed in the hydrocarbon space, because as the U.S. has receded as a demand driver and China's increased as a demand driver, it's obviously become very significant, not just as an oil purchaser for a country like Iraq, but as a gas purchaser for a country like Qatar also. So I think in the hydrocarbon space, the lure of the China market, but also the dependence on Chinese refiners and on Chinese state oil companies and energy companies is going to continue to increase. I think for Middle Eastern governments that want to diversify their development model and their economic posture over time, China presents some attractions, not just in a tactical sense because of the capital that can flow in, but frankly, I've noticed this in other regions around the world. Authoritarian developmentalism, which is essentially China's model, is attractive, and it's attractive not because other countries can necessarily replicate China. There's no place in the world that's really like China, that has a Leninist ruling party, a heavily state-backed economy in the way that state-owned enterprises function in China. But the way China's been able to get productivity gains, the way it's able to develop a manufacturing base, the way it's skilled its population and created an export sector, I think there are governments around the region that will find that attractive. And the United States, it's not a developing country. It hasn't been a developing country. In fact, you wouldn't really refer to the United States that way historically. So I think as China pushes various elements of its model developmentally around the region, that gives China a role as well, that the United States really hasn't been in that space and will, therefore, there's nothing to recede from, but is part of the kind of legacy that China's constructing in the region. It's why countries are looking to Beijing in a very diverse and different way than they've looked to the United States in the past. I hope that makes sense.
A question, Evan, this relates to you, but I'd like to turn to Dmitri just to hear his perspective. I'm interested also in the nexus of external powers and their involvement in the MENA region. And the question of China, China has taken a backseat to Russia in certain hotspots. Syria in particular, and they've largely been on the same page regarding Iran. But what's the likelihood, I guess from each of your perspectives, of growing friction between the two around areas where interests might diverge, especially as China's relative economic heft in the region and demand for energy grows? I don't know, Dmitri, just to give Evan a break, maybe you want to jump in, and then maybe Evan can provide your own perspective.
Okay, well, thank you, Patricia. The Sino-Russian relationship is based on a formula that essentially commands that the two countries are never against each other, but that they do not always have to be with each other. The beauty of that formula is that it also it creates two things. It creates a flexible partnership between Beijing and Moscow, and it allows the two countries to manage the areas where they have differences. A lot of people looking not just at the Middle East, but primarily at Central Asia, have been expecting China and Russia to collide. They have been expecting the two countries to enter into a conflict with each other for about 30 years, or at least 25 years. But the wait continues. China and Russia have managed not to work against each other. And I think that the Middle East offers another example where China and Russia have found ways to steer clear of each other. China does, as Evan very eloquently described, China is essentially involved in economics and finance and infrastructure and all these economic things. Russia is essentially a geopolitical actor, a supplier of arms and equipment. There, China and Russia may be, and actually they are competitors, but that's essentially a fairly light competition. I wouldn't expect China and Russia to undermine each other's positions in the Middle East. China is actually finding it useful that Russia, due to its character, steps forward. Russia is an in-your-face country. It steps forward. It's not afraid of a good fight. And China often takes a back seat, hides behind Russia, and actually benefits from that, let's say, division of labor. So I wouldn't expect China and Russia to come to blows or even to enter a serious conflict or even friction, substantial friction in the Middle East.
I'm going to sneak in a question since Evan, Evan, do you want to respond?
Sure. Dmitri said something interesting. He said China will often avoid a fight. I think actually China increasingly is willing to fight, but Russia's not one of the parties they're particularly interested in fighting with. What they have in common, as Dmitri implied, is that both countries are deeply ambivalent about American foreign policy and about American power. And so in this part of the world, as in other parts of the world, they have no reason to necessarily be at cross purposes because they share both a strategic interest and an ambivalence about the direction of American policy and American relationships. That's what they share. What they don't share is essentially the nature of the offering. And also, as Dmitri was implying, Russia simply doesn't offer in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, really anywhere what China offers, which is large-scale, state-backed infrastructure, finance, and capital. It doesn't have the same role as a demand driver. You just take a place like Iraq. I think Iraq now sells about half its oil production to China. And frankly, China's a customer for Russian hydrocarbon products as well. So I don't see the region as really a locus of friction between those two. And as Dmitri implied when he mentioned Central Asia, there's a region where we've been hearing for years that you'd see the emergence of friction. Russia has much more at stake, given its historical relationships, its political relationships in that region, but we just haven't seen it emerge. And so I would be very skeptical that it would emerge in this region as well. I think they find each other quite useful.
Thank you. Like I said, I was going to sneak a question to Dmitri before turning to Florence and Marc. The question comes from the audience. Will any U.S. cold shoulder to Saudi Arabia help Russia edge closer to this important Gulf power?
Well, one of the products of Russia's involvement in Syria has been a closer interaction with Saudi Arabia. And the last several years have seen much more interaction between Moscow and Riyadh on the issue of oil price, of Russia as a country that has joined the OPEC Plus, has emerged as very much a partner or counterpart for Saudi Arabia in that framework. Russia and Saudi Arabia have been supporting different sides in the Syrian civil war, but since both countries are essentially led by pragmatic leaders, they've been able to engage in some kind of a horse trading, some kind of I wouldn't call it cooperation, but some kind of interaction that allowed both of them to have to benefit from what may emerge in Syria post Bashar. It's also interesting that in some other places in the Middle East, Russia and Saudi Arabia are actually very much on the same page. Egypt has become again, for example, Egypt has become again a buyer of Russian military equipment and weapons. Egypt doesn't have the money to pay Russia, so the money comes from Saudi Arabia. In Libya, Russia has been acting in very close close cooperation with Egypt, but also with the Emirates and to a degree with the Saudis. So there's it's a web of interests, and Russia and Saudi Arabia over the past several years have found not only areas where they compete or where they can have a conflict, but also areas where they can find each other useful and collaborate to mutual benefit.
Thank you, Dmitri. I'd like to just briefly turn to Florence and ask just a question about the US and the EU, and what have been the US and or the EU responses to China and Russia influence tactics in the region, and challenges to US or EU interests, if you prefer. And how do you think we should be approaching challenges differently?
So the problem is obviously that we don't have an answer really, because when it comes to, well, you just mentioned influence tactic, but it's basically both China and Russia deploy tools that the EU doesn't master like they do. So when it comes to military force that Russia uses, Europeans are obviously reluctant to do that. When it comes to disinformation, we are barely putting together a response. And when it comes to unconditional, or rather unpolitical financial and economic cooperation, here clearly China has an advantage that the EU doesn't have. So in other words, the standard model of European approach to the region is being outflanked on the left by Russia and on the right by China. So in the old days, pre-Arab Spring or pre-2014, Europe would have been able to, at least with the non-Gulf producing states, to have more leverage because of economic cooperation. It saw itself, or it sees itself still actually, as a transformational power. The creation of a ring of friends and so forth. And now I think the buyers of that model are increasingly rare. So I think the honest answer to this question is that the EU is still doing the homework. I see the EU, when it comes to its foreign policy in the region, but probably in foreign policy in general, in a deep reflection process. So you see that, of course, in this debate on autonomy, sovereignty, in the strategic compass, etc., etc. And a lot of what the HRVP says, the language of power, all of these things are still ongoing, and we're still learning. But the fact is that at the moment, we are, if you're going to compare it to a football game, we are on the bench and thinking about what we should do next and how our interests could be met, because at the moment, they are not being met. But I might add that this is a notorious problem that the EU has, because in the region, a region of conflict and tension where the rules are upended, the EU is the one constantly reminding everybody of what the rules are or what they're supposed to be. So how do you win a game in which you're the only one reminding everybody of the rules and sticking to the rules, but nobody else.
Just to jump in, there's a relevant question from the audience to you, which I will direct to you, Florence, which is, honestly, the EU looks more and more irrelevant in the region. Even in the Mediterranean, look at Libya and Lebanon. Is France acting out of frustration from the EU?
I think this is an honest question, and I think it's absolutely candid to say that at the moment the EU is not the most important player, because we are not a security player, because we are not acting in all these ways that the others are doing. We're also not as ruthless as others. So we might be the good guys in the story, but at the end we don't win the girl. So I think I agree that we are, as I said, on the bench and reflecting at the moment. I think that the member states, France, of course, being a case in point, certainly do act where they feel that the EU as a collective is not acting enough. This is, of course, always this EU problem. The member state was the collective level, individual member states feeling that their interests aren't being met, that they don't get what they need. But I think in this particular case, now, because you mentioned France, it goes a little bit further, because I think for France, it's about more than terrorism, Islamism, what have you. I think for France, there's also a geopolitical power play at odds here, or in the cards, specifically when it comes to Turkey. So the whole reception of President Sisi, etc., has to be seen, I think, primarily in this light. And of course, France, if you want, is at a different level in terms of geopolitical reflection of its own role in the region than other member states are. I'm not saying, further advanced or behind, but it's just a different level. And I think that becomes indeed very apparent in its own actions, that in many ways deviate from what the consensus in the EU is when it comes to the region.
Thank you, Florence. Turning to Marc briefly, I have two questions which are sort of linked. One that comes from the audience. I'll read it out. Considering China's active economic presence and Russia's geopolitical intervention in the region, what could be an alternative for the EU to offer so as to enhance its image as a partner?
So, a quick follow-up to what Florence just said. Historically, the EU is a post-war project. Never again. After 75 years of French-German wars, 2 of them world wars, and basically the EU has been an exporter of values. Never again a conflict between ourselves, European, and we'll export this model to the outside world. Except that in the past 5 years, 10 years, you have been witnessing a rise of the authoritarian model. And when you look at a country like Turkey, well, because of their geographical position, because of the unresolved conflicts around them, Cyprus, maritime boundaries, Caucasus, and so on, and because of domestic political constraints, essentially, the Russian model looks more attractive than the European model, period. What I call the Crimea methodology is what Turkey is doing. You have an objective, it's not legal, you're going to be criticized, you're going to be sanctioned, but you move very quickly and you set foot, you create realities on the ground, and then you sort of transform these military realities into a political reality, which is what is happening around Turkey. That is not the model of governance that EU member states follow. Secondly, you have what we call the French-German engine within the EU, rather natural because these are the biggest 2 countries, but you have different traditions. Germany is still digesting its World War II complex, still very reluctant to build a big army, extremely reluctant to have foreign operations, military operations. And France is still operating on the Charles de Gaulle methodology. We are Europeans, and we're going to tell you other Europeans, how to do it. And that essentially doesn't work today because you have 27 member states, and then you don't have 26 member states that are going to follow a French lead. So it may be frustrating in both Berlin and Paris for different reasons, but it just doesn't work. Then turning to the question about JCPOA, I don't think a return to the nuclear agreement will change drastically the Russian attitude in Syria. What will matter there is whether, because you'd have a US administration returning to genuine multilateralism and in conjunction with the EU, maybe Russia will pay attention and will be willing, in order to sort of close this Syrian nightmare, which is rather costly, will turn to a UN-led process. And to some extent, different circumstances, you can think of the same thing in Libya. If the US, which is diplomatically active in Libya, and the special coordinator from the UN is a US diplomat seconded to the UN. If the EU wants to play a role, maybe we will come to some sort of progress. So I think a lot of what we have in front of us hinges upon a greater willingness of European states, heads of states and government, to act together and to act together between themselves and with the US.
Thank you. Given that we only have a few minutes left, what I'd like to do is begin to wrap up by asking one final question to the panelists. And we'll borrow from Kim Ratas from the previous panel by asking the question of how much does MENA matter to each of these external powers? And perhaps we can start with Marc and then go through counterclockwise with all the panelists. Marc?
Well, Mediterranean and Middle East matters enormously to the EU because of historical reasons, because of economic reasons, because of energy reasons, because of migration. And also, in a way, at least for some EU countries, cultural and educational reasons. So the influence is there. When it goes bad, like the Syrian war and the migration crisis in 2015, we can see a massive, really massive consequence for the EU, to the point that, remember, Chancellor Merkel said initially, that is in September 2015, that she will welcome Syrian refugees to Germany. And then for the following 4 years, she kept losing elections because of that, regional elections, Länder. So it has been a transformative. I mean, what happened in the Mediterranean Middle East in the past 5 years has been the transformative factor of politics in not only Germany, but also look at Hungary, Austria, countries that have taken an extremely negative view of migration, preventing an EU migration and asylum policy to take shape. So the consequences are there. Problem is, when do they get their act together? I mean, EU leaders.
Florence?
Yes, I think, you have to never forget that ultimately Europe moved from being a continent to being a political project. So I think this geographic component really is part of its DNA. And so it looks at the world through these geographic glasses. And so the Eastern and the Southern neighborhood, I mean, the term is EU lingo, but it's not chosen by coincidence, delineates the circles of importance in EU foreign policy. So the South and the East are the most important ones. Now, unfortunately, as Marc just said, level of importance is not reflected necessarily in the type of engagement that we would like at the moment. So, your question was, how important is it? Extremely important. But do we master the new approach that is necessary to be of importance? I think we're not there yet. But I do hope that we're getting there, because I feel that there is a tectonic shift happening, but at slow European speed. So perhaps not in 2021, but hopefully in the years after, we will see a more muscular approach to step up our own interests and build constructive relations.
Dmitri?
Well, the Middle East is fairly close geographically to Russia, about 1,000 kilometers south of the Russian border. The Middle East is the region where Russia has to deal with two important regional powers, Turkey and Iran. And that has a very significant impact on Russia's foreign policy south of Moscow. The Middle East is a predominantly Muslim region, and Islam is the second largest and fastest growing religion inside Russia. It's an area of significant non-Western financial resources, primarily in the Gulf. It's an area that specializes economically in oil and gas, precisely the staples of Russian exports. So it's very important that Russia and the countries in the region, primarily Saudi Arabia, but not only, are in sync about these things. It's also a region that is home to a large Russian-speaking diaspora in Israel. And there's a unique connection, unique relationship between Russia and Israel, which also sits in the Holy Land for Russian Orthodox people. And very lastly, Russia historically made a huge investment in the region, primarily in countries like Egypt and Syria and Algeria and a few others, something that's not forgotten by policymakers in Moscow.
Thank you, Dmitri. Evan, last but not least.
Sure. Well, as with most things with China and the world, it's important not to overgeneralize, but to break it down. I think you can break it down into strategic, economic, and aspirational components. Strategically, my view is it's not a high priority. It's distantly behind domestic security and stability, which is China's #1 priority. Security in the East Asian littoral, security on China's Asian periphery, its Central Asian and South Asian borders, and then down around 4th place, you begin to get into other regions of the world. So it's not a high priority. But then it grows when you then begin to link it to the economics. Economically, in the hydrocarbon space, it's important. China gets about 50% of its oil from the Middle East. But it's not nearly as important to China as it is to some of its neighbors. Japan gets 90% of its oil from the Middle East, and South Korea gets 85%. So it's important, but it's not as important as it is to some others. I think what's interesting about the economic profile is that it's of growing importance for logistics and for finance. Logistically, the reason China's making the investments in Dubai is because it is central strategically to what China's trying to do for further on exports to other parts of the world, including Europe, by the way, as well as Africa and other parts of the world. Aspirationally, and this is the last point, it is a test of the kind of power China wants to be in the world. Leveraging economics for strategic effect, using capital flows, things like the Belt and Road to try to increase its profile. And the Middle East in many ways is ground zero for that because China's been relatively successful with what is essentially a value-free foreign policy, leveraging economic tools for countries that have a demand-side pull for what China's offering. So 5 years from now, we'll see how they've done, but it's an interesting test of China's aspirations.
Thank you. I'd like to take the opportunity to now thank you all for your time. Thank you, Carnegie, for hosting this panel, and hopefully we will do this again in person next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.